In the quiet town of Eldridge, where whispers carried on the wind were more unsettling than the silence, Elizabeth Moore had committed the unspeakable. With her husband James frequently away on business, loneliness crept into her heart like the fog that rolled over the town each evening. It was during one such lonely spell that she met Thomas, a charming visitor from the next town over. Their affair was a flickering candle in Elizabeth's dimly lit life, but like all flames left unchecked, it was bound to set everything ablaze. James Moore was a man of routine and precision. His work as an engineer took him away from home, but his heart remained tethered to the wooden floors and sunlit corridors of the home he shared with Elizabeth. Returning home unexpectedly one chilly October evening, the remnants of autumn leaves crunching under his feet, James's world crumbled. The laughter that greeted him was unfamiliar, a sound that didn't belong in the mosaic of his marital life. Pushing the door ajar, the scene before him was like a dagger to his chest. Elizabeth and Thomas, wrapped in an embrace that shattered his reality. The confrontation was a symphony of screams and pleadings. Thomas escaped into the night, leaving Elizabeth with the fragments of her fractured vows. James, his mind a whirlpool of betrayal and heartbreak, walked into the enveloping darkness of their bedroom. There, in the solitude of their sanctuary, he penned a note, each word soaked with despair. Without a sound, he ended his life, leaving his pain and betrayal to echo through the empty house. His death was a quiet affair, much like the man himself. But death, as it turned out, was not a silencer but a loudspeaker. Elizabeth, racked with guilt, returned to an existence haunted not just by her actions but now, seemingly, by James himself. It began with small disturbances. Photographs found face down, cold spots in rooms once warm, whispers in the static of the television. As days turned into weeks, the manifestations grew more intense. Elizabeth would wake in the dead of night to the sound of James's favorite chair rocking back and forth. An empty glass would shatter in the dead of night as if thrown by an unseen force. The scent of James's cologne would suddenly permeate the air, thick and suffocating. Thomas, though not living with Elizabeth, felt the ripple effects of the haunting. His once peaceful nights were interrupted by nightmares of a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed, watching, waiting. Phone calls would come in the middle of the night, the line filled only with static and a faint murmuring that sounded eerily like James's voice. Fearful for her sanity, Elizabeth sought out a medium, a woman known among the locals as Whispering Helen. Helen, with her eyes clouded over as if veiled by the mysteries she dealt with, listened to Elizabeth's story with a pensive silence. After a long pause, she spoke in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of the unseen world. "You have tethered a restless spirit to this realm," Helen said, her voice trembling like the flame of a candle caught in a draught. "James's spirit lingers not just because of how he died, but why. He seeks not just to haunt, but to be acknowledged, to have his pain recognized and his story told." "But how do I make amends?" Elizabeth asked, desperation coloring her tone. "The path to peace is fraught with challenges," Helen warned. "You must first confront the truth of your actions, not just to yourself, but to the one you have wronged. You must face him." As Elizabeth left Helen's dimly lit parlor, the wind seemed to whisper James's name, a reminder that her journey to redemption was just beginning. As she stepped into the street, a shadow flickered at the edge of her vision, slipping away as quickly as it appeared. But the chill it left behind was a piercing reminder of the haunting that awaited her at home, and the long night that stretched before her. With this chilling reality settling like frost on her heart, Elizabeth knew that her path forward was not just to battle the hauntings, but to confront the past that had summoned them. As she walked back to the house she once called home, each step felt heavier than the last, knowing that with every step she was walking deeper into the spectral storm she had helped conjure. Elizabeth's return to the house was marked by a tangible shift in the air, a density that seemed to press against her as she pushed open the door. The foyer was dim, the late afternoon sun struggling to penetrate the thick curtains that shrouded the windows in gloom. She could feel the weight of James's presence, an oppressive blanket woven from threads of sorrow and betrayal. As she moved through the house, each room seemed to whisper secrets of the past, echoes of laughter and love that had once filled these spaces. Now, those memories twisted into something sinister, morphing into reminders of the betrayal that had poisoned her life. The atmosphere was charged with a static tension, as if the house itself was bracing for a storm. That night, as Elizabeth lay in bed, the haunting escalated. The clock in the hallway, which had stopped ticking the day James died, suddenly chimed midnight. Its bells rang out, not in the clear tone it once had, but in a distorted, dragging lament that chilled her to the bone. The sound seemed to herald the beginning of a night unlike any other. From the darkness of the hallway, the sound of footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate. They grew louder, approaching her bedroom door. Elizabeth pulled the covers up to her chin, her eyes wide with terror. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but the oppressive blackness of the hall, yet she felt a presence, an indescribable force that filled the doorway. "James?" Her voice was a whisper, barely audible over the pounding of her heart. There was no answer, but the temperature dropped, breaths of icy air brushing against her face. Then suddenly the weight of an unseen body sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped under its force, the sheets rustling softly. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat, her body paralyzed with fear. "You left me," a voice spoke, not through sound, but directly into her mind. It was unmistakably James's, but it bore the hollow timbre of the grave. "You broke us." "I'm sorry," she managed to choke out, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, James. Sorry." The word was a hiss, filled with pain and anger. "You condemned us both." The room grew colder, the shadows darker. Elizabeth felt the presence lean closer, its anger a palpable force. She wanted to run, to escape the room, but her body refused to obey. It was as if the spirit held her bound to the spot. "How do I make this right?" she pleaded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "The truth," the voice in her mind commanded. "Confess, let the world know your guilt. Free me." With a final chill that seemed to seep into her bones, the presence withdrew. The room warmed slightly, the oppressive feel lifting just enough for her to breathe. The bedroom door swung shut with a soft click, and Elizabeth was left alone in the silence of the night, her heart pounding and her mind racing. The next morning, under the gray light of dawn, Elizabeth made her decision. She would do as the spirit commanded. She called Thomas, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Thomas, we need to tell everyone. We need to confess everything about us." Thomas was silent for a moment, then sighed heavily. "Elizabeth, are you sure? Once this is out, there's no taking it back." "I know," she said, a resolve firming in her voice. "But it's the only way. Maybe then James will find peace. Maybe then this will all stop." Agreeing to meet at a local cafe, they planned to tell their families first, to face the consequences of their actions together. As Elizabeth hung up the phone, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this confession would be the key to calming the restless spirit of her husband. But as she prepared to step out, a cold breeze fluttered the curtains, and she couldn't shake the feeling that James's eyes were upon her, watching to see if she would indeed follow through with her promise. As she left the house, the echo of the midnight chimes rang in her ears, a reminder of the haunting that still lingered in her home. The morning was overcast, with heavy clouds threatening rain as Elizabeth made her way to the local cafe. The air felt charged, as if the storm brewing above mirrored the turmoil within her. Each step felt like wading through a dense fog, her mind preoccupied with the spectral encounters and the impending confession. The cafe was a quaint, usually inviting place with warm colors and the comforting aroma of coffee. Today, however, it felt like a stage set for a grim play. Thomas was already there, seated in a corner booth, his face drawn and pale. He looked up as Elizabeth approached, his eyes reflecting a mix of fear and resignation. "Elizabeth," he greeted, his voice low. "Are you ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, taking a seat opposite him. They ordered coffee, but it was clear neither had much appetite for it. "We start with our families," Thomas proposed, stirring his coffee absently. "Then we go public. It's going to be hard, but it's the only way to possibly put an end to this haunting." Elizabeth nodded, her heart heavy. "And if it doesn't work?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Then at least we tried to do the right thing," Thomas sighed. "We owe James that much." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their respective families. Elizabeth's parents and sister, along with Thomas's brother and close friend, gathered around the booth, confusion etched on their faces. "Why the sudden meeting?" Elizabeth's sister Anne asked, sensing the tension. Elizabeth took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "There's something Thomas and I need to tell you all," she began, her voice steady despite the shaking of her hands. "It's about me and Thomas. And James." The confession was painful. Words spilled out, tangled with tears and regrets. Elizabeth and Thomas recounted everything, from the loneliness Elizabeth felt when James was away, to the guilt and sorrow that followed the affair and James's tragic end. Silence enveloped the group as the story unfolded, the gravity of their revelation leaving everyone stunned. Elizabeth's parents were the first to react, their disappointment palpable. Yet, in their eyes, there was also a glint of sympathy. "Lizzie, what you did was wrong, but we're your family. We're here to help you through this," her father said, his voice firm but caring. Thomas's brother was less forgiving, his words sharp and accusing. "How could you do this to James? He was your friend." As the families grappled with the revelations, the atmosphere in the cafe seemed to grow even heavier, as if the storm outside had seeped indoors. Elizabeth felt exposed, as though not just her family, but the entire world was judging her. After what seemed like an eternity, the families departed, leaving Elizabeth and Thomas alone in their shared despair. The cafe now felt too small, the walls closing in on them. "We did what we could," Thomas said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "Now we wait and see if it's enough for James." As they left the cafe, the first drops of rain began to fall, slowly at first, then in a torrent, as if the heavens themselves were weeping over their confession. Elizabeth looked up into the rain, letting it wash over her face, mingling with her tears. When she returned home, the house seemed different. Was it quieter? Or was it simply waiting, holding its breath as she was, to see if James's spirit would find peace? That night, Elizabeth went to bed with a heavy heart. As she drifted towards sleep, the house remained still, unnervingly silent. But in the depths of the night, a familiar chill crept into her room. The scent of James's cologne filled the air, stronger than ever before. "Is it enough?" she whispered into the darkness, hoping for a sign. In response, the shadows seemed to stir, and a faint voice echoed through the room, a voice that carried the sorrow of the grave. "Almost," it whispered, the word lingering like a promise or a curse. Elizabeth lay awake the rest of the night, wondering what more she could do to appease the spirit of the man she had once loved, the man whose death had bound him to this world of shadows and whispers. The haunting was not over, and the path to redemption was more complex and tortuous than she had ever imagined. The following days fell into a haunting rhythm for Elizabeth. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, its walls steeped in memories and sorrow. The air seemed perpetually cold, and the shadows longer and darker. Despite her confession, the disturbances continued, subtle yet unmistakably menacing. Elizabeth knew she hadn't done enough to appease James's tormented spirit. In desperation, she revisited Whispering Helen, hoping for more guidance. The medium's small parlor was as unwelcoming as Elizabeth remembered, with its heavy curtains and the pervasive scent of incense that did little to mask the chill in the air. "His spirit is still restless," Elizabeth explained, her voice a mix of fear and frustration. "We confessed everything, but he said it was almost enough. What more does he want from us?" Helen closed her eyes, her fingers lightly touching the crystal ball on the table before her. The room grew colder, the shadows seeming to pulse with a life of their own. "His pain is deep, rooted not just in your betrayal, but in the life he left unfinished.
Helen finally spoke, her eyes still closed. James is bound here by more than just his death. He is tethered by unfulfilled promises and dreams left to wither. But how do I find out what he needed to finish? Elizabeth asked, a note of desperation in her voice. You must delve into his past, into the life he led before the end, Helen replied, opening her eyes to fix Elizabeth with a penetrating stare. There you will find what binds him to this world. Armed with this new insight, Elizabeth returned home with a sense of purpose. She began in the attic, the place where James had kept his personal belongings. Boxes filled with old photographs, letters, and various mementos from his life. As she sifted through the dusty boxes, a particular photo caught her eye. It was an image of James standing beside a half-built house, his face beaming with pride. Elizabeth remembered him mentioning the project years ago. It was meant to be their dream home in another town, but financial difficulties had forced them to abandon it. Next to the photo, she found a folded piece of paper. It was a letter from James to his brother, never sent, expressing his regret over not finishing the house. The letter was filled with hopes for the future, plans that were never realized. Realizing this might be the key to freeing James's spirit, Elizabeth decided to visit the site of the unfinished house. The next morning, she drove to the location, the old address etched in her memory. The site was overgrown, nature reclaiming the land where the foundation had been laid. The structure was little more than ruins, but as Elizabeth walked among them, she felt a profound connection to James's hopes and dreams. She spoke aloud, addressing the lingering spirit of her husband. "James, I found the place you cared about so much," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet. "I'm here to honor your dream, to acknowledge what was important to you." As she spoke, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees and the decrepit remains of the construction. A sense of peace seemed to settle over the area, the oppressive weight that had clung to her lifting slightly. Returning home, Elizabeth felt a change. The house seemed lighter, the air warmer. For the first time in weeks, she slept through the night without disturbances. However, the peace was short-lived. In the cold light of dawn, she found a new message waiting for her on the bathroom mirror, written in the steam from her shower. More to tell. The words sent a chill down her spine. It was clear that while she had made progress, there was still more to uncover about James's life and death. The path to redemption and peace was longer and more complex than she had anticipated, and the stakes were higher than just her own peace of mind. She needed to delve deeper into the echoes of the past, to fully understand, and perhaps finally free the tormented spirit of James Moore. Determined to uncover what else tethered James's spirit to the mortal realm, Elizabeth dedicated herself to sifting through more of his belongings, each item a piece of the puzzle that was his hidden past. The dusty attic became her frequent haunt, where hours slipped by unnoticed as she delved deeper into the life James had lived before their paths had crossed. Among the various keepsakes, Elizabeth found a locked box, its key missing, tucked away beneath a pile of old engineering books. The box was sturdy, with intricate engravings that suggested it was something James cherished. Resolute, Elizabeth took it to a locksmith, who managed to open it without causing damage. Inside, she discovered a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, their pages yellowed with age. They were from a woman named Clara, whose tender words painted the portrait of a deep, secret love, one that Elizabeth had never known about. The letters spanned several years, detailing plans and promises, dreams of a future together that never came to fruition. The last letter was different. It was a farewell, filled with sorrow and a final goodbye, dated just a few months before Elizabeth had met James. The woman wrote of moving away, unable to bear the proximity to a life she could never have. Elizabeth sat back, the letters falling from her hands. The revelation shook her, not just because of the affair, but because it cast James's emotions and perhaps even his motives in a new light. It seemed he too had known heartbreak, had concealed his wounds beneath a facade of normalcy.
Feeling a mix of empathy and betrayal, Elizabeth realized that to free James, she needed to confront this part of his past as well. She decided to track down Clara to learn more about the story the letters only partially told. Her search led her to a small coastal town a few hours away. Clara, now an elderly woman living quietly by the sea, was initially reluctant to dredge up the past. However, sensing Elizabeth's genuine distress and need for answers, she agreed to talk. Sitting across from Clara in her modest living room, Elizabeth listened as the old woman recounted her love for James. It was a bittersweet tale, full of passion and pain, ultimately unfulfilled due to differing paths and ambitions. Clara spoke of James's kindness and his deep remorse for the hurt their relationship had caused. "He never wanted to hurt anyone," Clara said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "When we ended things, it broke him. I think he hoped to find peace with you." Returning home, Elizabeth felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. The pieces of James's past were fitting together, forming a picture far more complex than she had ever imagined. That night, as she lay in bed, she spoke to the air, hoping James could hear her. "I know about Clara now. I understand there was more to your pain than I realized. I'm sorry for the part I played in all your suffering," she whispered into the silence. The house responded. A soft gust of air brushed her cheek, carrying a faint scent of the cologne James used to wear. It was a gentle acknowledgement, a sign that perhaps she was moving in the right direction. However, the peace was once again fleeting. The following morning, Elizabeth found another note, this time on the kitchen counter, written in a shaky hand that mirrored the tremors of a soul not at rest. "Find the place where I lost my heart." Elizabeth pondered the cryptic message. It wasn't about Clara or the unfinished house. There was yet another chapter of James's life she needed to explore, another wound to mend. Determined, she prepared for a deeper dive into his past, ready to follow wherever the haunting clues might lead her next. The journey was far from over, and each revelation seemed to pave the way to deeper, darker corners of James's life, each demanding recognition and resolution.
Elizabeth's search for the place where James had lost his heart led her to a secluded spot deep in the woods outside Eldridge. According to an old friend of James who reluctantly shared the information, it was here that James's younger brother had tragically died during a childhood adventure gone wrong. The event had deeply affected James, marking a point of sorrow that he carried silently throughout his life. Armed with this new knowledge, Elizabeth drove to the coordinates given by the old friend, the dense forest enveloping her as she ventured further from the town. The place was shrouded in a perpetual twilight, the thick canopy above stifling the light, as if guarding its secrets. She walked until she came upon a clearing where the trees parted to reveal a small, serene lake. The beauty of the spot belied its tragic past. Here, amidst the whispers of the wind through the leaves, she felt the weight of James's unspoken grief. "James, I'm here," Elizabeth called out into the quiet, her voice steady despite the trembling of her heart. "I know about your brother. I know this is where you lost a part of yourself. I'm so sorry for your pain." The air around her grew colder and the wind whipped up, bending the trees with its fury. Elizabeth could feel James's presence, more intense and powerful than ever before. The lake's surface rippled as if touched by unseen hands, and a low moan echoed around the clearing. Suddenly, the peaceful facade of the lake shattered as the waters churned violently. Elizabeth staggered back as the wind seemed to howl with rage. From the tumultuous water emerged a spectral figure, water cascading off its formless body, its face a mask of grief and anger. "You have brought me here, but it is not enough," the ghostly voice of James roared over the storm. "Too much has been broken, and sorrow alone cannot mend it." Elizabeth, realizing that James's spirit would find no peace, felt a deep despair. "What can I do?" she cried out. "Please tell me how to release you." "The pain, it binds me." James's voice was a tortured whisper now, swirling around her. "Only in death can it truly end. You must join me, as must he who shared in your betrayal." Fear gripped Elizabeth's heart as she understood his words.
This was not just a plea. It was a demand for atonement through shared suffering. Before she could run, the spectral figure advanced, its form stretching out like tendrils of mist. Elizabeth felt a cold grip around her heart, squeezing with an unbearable pressure. She gasped for air, her vision blurring as she fell to her knees. Simultaneously, miles away, Thomas experienced a similar assault. Alone in his home, he was overcome by an invisible force, the air thickening around him like quicksand. His last breaths were ragged and filled with fear, his heart bursting with the torment of the vengeful spirit. As Elizabeth's consciousness faded, she saw James's face, not as the vengeful specter, but as the man she once loved, filled with sorrow and loss. "Forgive me," she whispered, the world dimming around her. The storm ceased abruptly, the forest falling silent, the lake once again calm and seemingly untouched. Elizabeth and Thomas, bound by their deceit and James's undying grief, were consumed by the shadows of the past, their final moments a testament to the destructive power of unresolved sorrow and betrayed love. In the clearing by the lake, all that remained was a chilling silence, the echoes of the tragedy lingering like a mournful dirge, a reminder of the cost of secrets and the depths of a haunted heart.